Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Bookaccino live book group. I'm Carol Fitzgerald from Reading Group Guides and Book Reporter, both sites from the Book Report Network, and we are so happy to have you joining us this evening, where our guest is Kate Morton, and we're going to be discussing her fabulous book, Homecoming. I mean, how stunning is that cover, everybody? I mean, isn't it just beautiful? As Kate Eyre, a Book Reporter reviewer, said last May, Homecoming challenges readers to figure out who was involved in the deaths of 4 people. And at the same time, it goes beyond that. Would you have done the same? Would you forgive? Would you understand? Once again, Morton has proved why she's hailed as one of the best. Homecoming was one of my 2023 Book Reporter Bets On selections, and actually is one of my 3 favorite books of the year. And it's a kind of book where I would just hand it to people and say, you're absolutely going to love this. And I was really happy when people come back and say, I did. I felt exactly the same way. So let's go over what the format is going to be for tonight's program. It's going to be as follows. And let me start by noting that we're assuming everyone has read the book. Okay, this is not the kind of book group that you can cheat on. We're going to assume you read it because we're going to be talking spoilers. So just know that when you show up here, you might be hearing things that you didn't think about before if you haven't finished the book. I'm going to begin with a discussion with Kate, and then 4 of our readers are going to be joining us live, and I'll be asking questions for a couple of camera-shy folks who submitted questions for me to share. And then we're going to take questions from the audience, from the Q&A down below. So if you have a question, that's the place to put it. Please don't drop it in the chat because we won't be able to find it as easily. So drop your questions there, and that will be only shared with our voice of God, Tom Donadio, our editorial director, who's going to be looking for questions to ask at the end of the show. With that housekeeping behind us, let's welcome Kate to the stage and give her a very warm welcome. You're here.
Here I am. I got there.
I love this. I love this. And you're proving that there's tomorrow because it's 9 o'clock there. Is it 9 o'clock in the morning?
It is 9:36 where I am. I'm in South Australia. In fact, I'm right where Homecoming is set.
This is fabulous. This is fabulous.
There's the rose gardens just out there, the Hen Hilton's just up the driveway. So I'm on site.
You're on site. So if you have any questions, it's like, wait, I'll just run outside and see where it is.
I'll check.
Be right back. Let me go take a picture for you. You know, it's great to see you again. We saw each other live, I guess, about 6 years ago. We did an event together in New York.
We did.
And it was so much fun. And we talked last year when the book came out, but we haven't had a chance to get together since then. And I'm really looking forward to tonight as well.
I am too. I'm so looking forward to the next time we see each other in person. But tonight will be a good stand-in. I'm so glad to be able to do it this way.
It's going to be either, well, we'll decide whether you're coming north or I'm going south. We'll have to figure that out. We'll have to figure out who's going to be doing the long flight. So let's begin with you sharing a story of Homecoming and what inspired you to write it. Because if I remember, let's see, in 2020, I think it was April, you were going to go to Australia for a very short vacation from London. And then what happened?
Well, do we need to cast our minds back too far to 2020 to remember what happened in the beginning of that year? Yes, in fact, it was March, and we were planning to come. We were living in London. We'd been there for 5 years, and we were planning to come back for an Easter visit to Australia to see family. And then, as we all know, the pandemic started rumbling along at the beginning of that year, and within March it was all happening very, very quickly, and we started to see that flights were being cancelled. There were talks of lockdowns. Australia was talking about closing borders, and we thought, well, if we don't go now, we might not be able to see family for quite some time. Things are very uncertain. We happened to have a flight booked. My 3 children were at school, and school went online, and it's all culminated in the space of a few days. And we thought, well, let's go now. We'll have Easter in Australia. We'll see family, and then we'll come back to London in a couple of months when the pandemic's over and get on with our lives. And of course, that's not quite how it happened. Instead, we managed to catch one of the last flights out of London, and it was this sort of really late winter, grey and grim, and that horrible start of the pandemic. We flew through the longest 24-hour flight back to Australia. It was so strange. I mean, it's long haul is always discombobulating, but it was extra strange because people were in hazmat suits and our temperature was being taken everywhere we landed, and flights were dropping off the board at all the airports we had to stop at on the way, and shops were shuttering and closing indefinitely. And when we arrived back in Australia, it having come from the late winter, it was late summer, and Australian light I have heard described by a photographer as being two f-stops overexposed. It's so bright and so yellow and so sunny. And we landed up after this sort of long flight in this beautiful late summer farm garden with big heavy roses dropping their heads and cherry tomatoes growing wild. And it was such a contrast that it really exemplified the chaotic and somersaulty nature of that time. And so that is how I arrived in Australia and began quarantine, thinking we'd head back, and finding that sometimes the best laid plans do not go as one expects them to.
And when you left London, you had a book you had started, and you're saying, oh, I'll go there, I'll finish it. I think you were 25,000 words in, something like that. And you got down there, and how did you start feeling?
Well, I was a year into the planning and writing of that book. And in fact, it's set in Europe. And as we flew out of London, I looked down over Europe and I thought, I'll see you soon. I had all sorts of research trips and meetings planned. And these were, what I was expecting to get back to do. And instead, as you say, we found ourselves in Australia. And the distance I felt geographically, but also emotionally, I suppose, from that book that I had been writing over the winter in London was so extreme that all of a sudden I found that I would open my file to start working, and I couldn't get back in. And for me, when I write it, the world of the book is very alive. It lives and it breathes, and I need it to feel like that in order to have the faith to keep going. And I kept on. I mean, writing is what I do, so I would open it every day and I would try again, but it felt dead. And I kept on, and I pushed it for quite some time before I realized that I wasn't going to be able to find a way to bring life back into it. But thankfully, in the meantime, being in Australia while the pandemic was, the beginning of the pandemic was on, and I think that changed the way, for many of us, the way we looked at the world around us. And certainly for me, I found Australia is a place I know so well that I almost don't see it. But because of the changed circumstances, I was more aware. Again, everything was granular in some way, and I was more aware of things that I had taken for granted. I could suddenly see through new eyes, and the world of the story that became Homecoming started to take place. Whether it was Percy, the character of Percy, the prologue, what he discovers, the way the light feels, the sense of place that's within the book, all of these things started to animate my imagination, and the world of Homecoming started to conjure to life, while the other core book started to sink away, and disappear into the background of my life.
Yeah. And did you just start writing, or were you visualizing the story in your head before you sat down to write, or were you just taking some notes as you went along? How did the beginning begin?
All of the above. So I always think that writing a book there are three different distinct phases. There's the dreaming at the beginning, then there's the writing, and then there's the editing. And for me, the dreaming is an essential, lengthy period in which the world of the book, the colors, the feeling, the characters, the story, the twist at the heart, the themes, the ideas, all of those things start to come to life. And I think about it, I sort of in tandem with my real life is this fictional world it doesn't turn off. It's there all the time. And everything that I see and think and feel in my real life feeds in some way into the world of the book. And so this was starting to happen in earnest while I was settling my family and trying to make sense of the new world that we all found ourselves living within in 2020. And one of the things that we did, because where we ended up in Australia is a small farm outside of Adelaide at the very south of South Australia. And we would, because we had to do quarantine, we weren't allowed to leave. So to get some exercise and get the kids out of the house, we would walk the perimeter. And part of that walk took us along a creek on which willows grew. And it was, I'm sure, doing that walk multiple times a day, just to, for everybody to stay sane, that for everyone who's read the book, which I am assuming is everyone here tonight, the world that we see, the scene that we see when Percy rides his horse back into town that Christmas Eve and makes his discovery on the banks of the creek beneath the willow. I'm sure that's where that started to come to life for me. I didn't see anything quite like that, thankfully, but I could imagine it all too well.
Yeah, and it's like, I think that during the pandemic, we would draw ourselves back into looking at things differently, because the things that you rush past, the things that you say, oh, like that, all of a sudden you start understanding, oh, the hydrangeas are really blooming. Oh, there's another flower. The whole pace slowed down at the same time. And we were like breathing. We were breathing again and saying, well, we're not going to rush to here. We're not going to rush to there. Remember you saying the boys were doing homework or school at like 1 a.m. I mean, everything was just different. It was just a different way of looking at everything. So that gave you a chance to breathe, look around. And then did you start writing right away, or did you say, wait, I still think about that other book over there?
Yeah, I mean, what you say there is so true, Carol. And although I would never, obviously, wish a pandemic upon us again, I think stopping and taking the time to see things that we take for granted in that way is so important. And I think it's the releasing too of all of those the rules. School starts at this time, work is here, this is when the bus goes. These things start to become very strict guardrails within our lives, and when they suddenly are released, there is all of this time and space in which to I don't know, see things differently, create a new way, a new mode of living. And I think that's what happened for so many people. And certainly, as you say, in my life, with the kids doing school from home, but not only that, logging on to their schools in London at 6 p.m. Australian time was very odd. And it left a lot of time free in the day once we were finished quarantine and allowed to leave the premises again, to do a bit of a sort of unguided exploring of the sort that you don't usually do in around your own home. And I mean, one of the things we did was a road trip north for a couple of hours from where we are in the Adelaide Hills to a place called the Clare Valley. There's a town called Mintaro, and I had heard this story about a big old house which was up there in the Clare Valley that had a sort of tragic story attached to it. And of course, I hear this and I have to go and see it. So we decided, well, this is the perfect time. We've never been able to do it before. Let's go and do it. And so we drove up, and it was such a stunning sight that the house I'm talking about is called Martindale Hall. And it is a beautiful replica of an English Georgian house built out in the Australian landscape. So immediately there's that sort of frisson of seeing a piece of architecture in a landscape to which it doesn't naturally belong. And for me, this is right up my alley. Not only do I love landscapes and houses, but that strange sense of, this it's interesting that this has been built here. That really got me sparked on this story idea that was starting to come to life, particularly a book about, I was already thinking so much in the circumstances about home and belonging and what it means to come home, and that this location that one can feel having lived in more than one country, and finding oneself that both feel like home. And so where is home really, and where do I really belong? And all these questions interest me generally, and certainly interested me in 2020 when we were sort of forced to make home in a place where we hadn't been expecting to do so. Yeah. And so yes, that this house too, I sense those same themes of a slight dislocation of seeing the house in these unusual surroundings.
Yeah, it's like, wait a second, this is just so gorgeous, but where am I? What's going? It's all this disconnect. It's a disconnect that you're trying to connect back to, and it's just not there. So,
and that's so fruitful in fiction. That feeling is, for me anyway, that sparks all of my writerly instincts.
And then are you sketching the house as you're standing there because the house to you means a lot, or it's just in your head?
Yeah, it's both. I mean, I love pens and paper, so I carry these with me all the time, and I take copious notes, so many thousands of times more notes than will ever make their way into any book that I write. But I love to do it, and I'm convinced that the very act of taking a pen in one's hand and writing words on a piece of paper somehow infuses those ideas. It connects pen to mind. For me anyway, I don't know whether it will remain the same for future generations. Whenever my kids are at school and they start to do work online instead of with pens and paper, a part of me thinks, yeah, how are you going to remember things if you don't write it down and feel your own hand trace those words across the page? But perhaps that's old-fashioned thinking, but for me, it's essential. And so throughout the creation of a book, I will end up with 10, 11, 12, 15, 20 notebooks filled with scribble writing, sketches, questions to myself, ideas, things I've seen, heard, snatches of conversation, all of those things. Because I have come to learn, there's that adage that if something's important enough, you'll remember it. Not me. Perhaps it's a failing of my memory, but no, it's much better if I write it down.
But it's like, do you have the grocery list and then look at the beautiful one with the one before, something like that? It's
always. And in fact, I've just recently been in the storeroom where I have big tubs for each book containing every notebook, every draft, all of the bits and pieces. And I can pick up notebooks from when I wrote The House at Riverton, which was then The Shifting Fog, back in 2004 or thereabouts, and open the notebooks. And they look exactly the same as the notebooks for Homecoming and the notebooks for the book I'm working on now, with scribbled ideas and then phone numbers of someone who's talked to me at the same time. They are, if anyone ever had to go through them and make sense of where the ideas came from, good luck to them.
Good luck, folks. But there's the doctor's appointment. I guess I went. I'm not so sure. The Turner family tragedy of 1959 still haunts this town in December 2018, 60 years later. And it's the town lore. Did you know that, like, what was hidden from the start, or did you learn it as time goes on? Like, did you say, I know, or did you say, I just wrote myself into a wall?
It's a bit of both. I mean, as I say, there are these 3 stages, and in the dreaming stage, I really do before I start writing, I have a very strong sense of the world of the book, the house, the family, the story, what's going to happen, what the twist might be. Often I know what I want readers to think at the beginning, and I know it isn't what really happened, but sometimes I don't know exactly what really happened or how it really happened. And I have learned with time to trust myself that it will come to me as I write, because it does, because the writing of any book involves making tens of thousands of decisions along the way and coming up with tens of thousands of small ideas, because of course a book is a complex living organism, and it's impossible to know everything from the start. And if you do, when I started and I wrote 2 manuscripts before I wrote The House at Riverton. And when I was writing the book that became The House at Riverton, I was still a beginner really, and I would plot everything out very rigidly, and then I would go and spend the day, say, with my mum, and we would walk around the nearby antique centre, and I would see something, and because my book is always in my head, it would spark an idea of, oh, maybe that's what the children, you know, can have. This is the game they play, and maybe this is what happens. And then I would get excited and rush back home to write it, but I'd think, but that's not what I'd planned. And maybe it's not the right thing. And maybe I'm taking the book in the wrong direction. And I was really rigid about how I felt one should follow the plot that had been laid out in the notebook. But now I realize that that's the joy of writing a book. It's discovering those things along the way. And the book really it does become a part of my my lived experience. And I love that things that I see and think on one day that I might not otherwise have seen belong in the book because the ideas came that day, and that's okay. And so it really does live and breathe and move and grow and become a sort of time capsule for the writer's life during the period in which it was written. And it would be different written at any other time.
Right. If you were doing House at Riverton now, you would see the book completely differently, just because of what you've written, what you've done, what you've seen along the way. It would be a different story.
And who I am. I'm, you know, 20 years older now. You know, the world has shown me different things. But I love that. You know, I can't guarantee when the book will be read by a reader, and so it depends on the time of their life as to what sense they make of it. And I love that they're never fixed because they depend upon the reader to bring them back to life.
You know, and people are still reading The House of Riverton. People are still going, and that I always say that whatever book you're picking up is a new book to you. No matter how long the book's been out, it's new to you, and what you're going to discover through that book is where you're going to be at this point in your life, and you're going to take it. If you read that book 20 years later, you might see the book completely differently.
Absolutely. I love it. That is one of my favorite things about the public part of publication, is that I write a book and finally it's wrested away from me and put into print. And so you could say that it is now a fixed version, but it's not, because each time a reader anywhere in the world at any time picks it up, they bring it back to life, and it's the meeting of our two minds across time and space to bring back and create this unique version of the story. I mean, that's why we can still, as individuals, have a dialogue with Jane Austen by picking up one of her books and bringing it to life, and all of our own experiences and our own identities and personalities in the world in which we live help us to reanimate the story that she wrote and create a version that is unique to us. I love that.
Yeah. And it becomes a book is still personal to you. It's personal to you when you write, and it's personal to the reader when they read it. And that's the reason I always see people say, oh, do you ever not like a book? And I said, that's not mine to share, because that has nothing to do with how you might feel. So you're never going to hear it. It's never going to come from me, you know? So we're going to have some readers join us for questions now. And the first is going to be Debbie Moore. And Debbie is one of our longtime Bookaccino Live book group participants. She's joining us today from South Carolina with a couple of questions. So Debbie, take it away.
Thanks, Carol. Hi, Kate. It's really
Hi, Debbie.
Nice to meet you. I've read all of your books. I've fallen in love with all of them, including Homecoming. And a couple of questions I have about Homecoming. In this book, you don't only have dual timelines, but you also have three perspectives on the same story: Jess's, Nora's, Daniel Martin's. How did you keep track of all of that as you were writing the story?
That's a great question. I'm lucky that the way, well, I suppose it's not luck. The way I write books is very intuitive for me. I don't know that I would be able to write them in any other way. So I like to have those different viewpoints, because one of the themes that I come back to over and over is the idea of the mutability of truth. I mean, even insofar as my books are mysteries, the mystery is often history has recorded an event in one way, and we find out that there's another way to look at it, and that some of the information wasn't known. And by discovering that, whether it's through a family secret or information that a third party has that hasn't been divulged, we see the same events in a different way. And so having different voices who know partial elements of the story is, for me, a really fruitful way to tell the story. I mean, it's a bit like if you were drawing house plans. You know how you can look at them and you can have the bird's eye view, and then you can have the architectural rendering from different perspectives. Each character brings a different one of those, and I have to carry the schematic in my mind that puts them all together as a fully three-dimensional house or story, as the case may be. As for keeping track of them, the notebooks, of course, and I have started to work, even when I work on my computer, in a way where this is real nitty-gritty practical answer, where I actually can color code the different scenes. And so I can really see have an overview of how much of the story each person is telling. But I love doing it, and we don't want to hear the same piece of information 3 times, you know. So working out which character has which part and which of the other characters know these details is one of the most enjoyable parts of the storytelling for me.
Well, you do it very well, I have to say.
Thank you.
In many of your books, the natural world and or large mansions or estates play a key role in your stories. What attracts you to this types of settings?
You're absolutely right. I mean, I adore the natural world. So anytime I have an opportunity to bring it to life on the page, I will take that. Sense of place is very important to me in a novel, whether I'm writing it or reading it. I really want my readers to feel that they have gone somewhere that comes to life around them, and a world in which they can live that feels even more real than the real world while they're turning those pages. And with houses, I have loved houses since I was very, very small. I love them architecturally. I like the layout. My parents used to take us on weekends to look inside houses. My mum used to sit up and draw plans for houses. I think she would have made a very good architect, and she really enjoyed that sort of layout. And so I have been aware of the way layouts work since I was small. So I love them architecturally, I love them aesthetically, but also in terms of fiction, metaphorically. I mean, I mentioned Martindale Hall, and the idea that what excited me and what sparked ideas for Homecoming was the fact that it seemed beautiful, but somehow a bit eerily dislocated, standing in the South Australian landscape. And I liked the idea of putting a character like Isabel in a house like that, because she is experiencing the same sort of thing, having been dislocated from her home of England to live in Australia, a very different landscape. And even one of the things I enjoyed writing for Isabel was her sense that her own children, you know, living creatures who she had grown and given birth to and raised, were still somehow distanced from her because they were Australian children, and no matter that she'd lived there for the length of years she wasn't, and that created that distance. So the house where she lives, Halcyon, became a great metaphor for that experience that she was having within the pages of the book.
Yeah, thank you. Did you have a theme in mind when you wrote this book, or when you started to write it? Because I've seen it described as a mystery, a family saga, a search for home. How would you describe Homecoming?
Well, it's all of those things. And often if I have to think about all of my books, because I do think these themes aren't necessarily chosen by the author, that they're part of me. They're the things that interest me as a person. And I could try to write a book that didn't take up those themes, and I think they'd find their way in, because I think I'm constantly trying to work them out myself. And they are all of those: history, mystery, and memory. The way the past and the present interact, that for me is something I will never get tired of writing about. One of my favorite poets is T.S. Eliot. And I think this is one of his obsessions too. And in fact, at the start in March 2020, when I was standing in the garden here at the farm, feeling so discombobulated, having left wintry London and landing, and the pandemic was swirling, I felt this curious stillness. And the line came into my mind from his poem Burnt Norton about the still point of the turning world. And that is where I felt myself to be. And when he is writing about that, the place where past, present, and future meet, that is how I felt, standing in the world swirling around outside, but all was still where I was. And that idea I took and fed into the book that became Homecoming. So along with all traditional themes that I love, women's stories, maternity, constructed identity, and of course the mutability of truth that always interests me. The way I knew from the beginning that we would have a character like Nora, who we have one perspective on, but as we learn more and we start to hear different voices, our view of her and of what's gone on within that family can shift.
Thanks. I just want to say I can't wait till your next book. I'm really looking forward to it. So wherever it's set, whatever it's about, but I really appreciate your time and your answers to the questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks for such great questions, Debbie. Thanks for being here.
Debbie, thanks as always. We're so glad to have you here. And now joining us is Katie DeMail. She is from Rochester, Minnesota, and she's got a question.
Thanks, Carol. Yeah. Hi, Kate. Nice to meet you.
Hi, Katie. Lovely to meet you.
Yes. The question I have for today is, the book, as we know, we've all read it, is a balance between the past and present, the dual timeline. So Debbie touched on this a little bit in her question as well, but I'm going to take it one level deeper and just ask the question, when you write the book, do you write each timeline separately, or do you write the book as it appears to the reader, right? Transitioning back and forth between the two timelines?
In the past, when I've been asked a question like that, I've always, without even thinking about it, said, oh, I write it in the order that you read it. And I was thinking about that recently, and I don't think it's actually true anymore. Often when you're asked at the end of the process, it's all a bit of a haze. It all sort of happened back then, and, oh, yes, in the order. But when I first started out, and I alluded to this before, I used to be a lot more organized, I suppose, and prescriptive in the way that I wrote. I would plot it out, and perhaps because I was less confident, I would write very much according to what I had set out in my notebook. But as I've gone on, and I think it was, again, to be quite practical in my answer, around about my fourth book, The Secret Keeper, I changed the way I wrote on my computer. I used to use just one document, and I would open it and I'd start at the beginning and keep writing. But I started to use a program that enabled me to break the story into scenes and keep track of them down one column of the monitor. And it changed my writing life, because that is much more the way my brain works. I can be writing a scene at the beginning, and because of the way I always think of book, and certainly my books, it's like if you took a tapestry and turned it over and looked on the back, and there are actually all sorts of little threads joining different stitches, that the reader who's looking at the front wouldn't know and doesn't expect, but there they are. So this enabled me to be working at the beginning and write a piece of dialogue and think, oh, later on in the book, and I can always tell, maybe about 2/3 of the way through, I'm going to need a scene where we see that isn't actually true. Now I can duck down to that part and make a note for myself to put something to that effect at that stage of the book. So when it came to Homecoming, I did write from beginning to end, but things like, I didn't know I was going to have Daniel Miller's book until I reached that part and realized that I was going to need a way to tell the historical storyline. And I happened to come up with the idea of the true crime book. So I was able to break that one up into parts and write it as I needed it rather than because to write the whole book, I would have had bits that we've learned in other ways, and I don't want to be repetitive by giving the same information twice.
The technology is fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. I didn't know that you could do that. That's amazing.
Yeah, you can. And in a way, it's actually making a technological version of a very practical way of doing it, like as you would with file cards or a big pin board where you can pin things up and get a visual overlay. I'm quite visual, so I do like to be able to see the broader story laid out in that way.
Fascinating. Yes. Thank you.
You're welcome.
One part to the next. Thank you so much, Katie. So we've got Dina Winner from Lansdale, Pennsylvania, asked me to share this question with you. First of all, she loves all of your books. As she said, my daughters and I can't wait till the next one. In fact, both daughters bought me Homecoming for Christmas. I love that they both knew her so well. I've encouraged so many to read it also. Thank you for sharing your gift of writing with us. Her question is, what about the men? How did both of the fathers seem to think it was okay to be away from their wives and children on New Year's, or to be okay when your wife was going away to give birth? I realized this wasn't much about them so much, but curious as to what these characters were thinking. So you created them. Get us to their side of the story.
Well, I think in the case of Mr. Turner, who's having a lovely time in London that Christmas, I mean, he is a charming character, but he is also a bit of a cad. He's married his English wife, he's brought her back, he's bought the house of his dreams, and then he's developed a new dream and moved on to that. So I think that just goes to his character, having stranded Isabel over the Christmas. And in the case of Nora's husband, Mr. Bridges, I think that's more about Nora. She decides that where she wants to be is at the farm with her extended family, and so that is what she does. And I don't think anyone can tell Nora to do anything she doesn't want to do.
Well, Nora's in her place, and the men, they're just going to go along with like what's going on. There we go.
Yes.
Mary Lou Walksmith, who from Denver, Colorado, is a big time reader of our site, and she's always corresponding. It's just lovely notes back and forth. She had the following to share in a question. I love this. She just finished her second read of Homecoming on audio, and Claire Foy, the narrator, did an incredible job. I love this book so much and felt completely immersed in the story and beautiful writing. I love and adore a book stop book, and I have a healthy regard for an author who can competently and beautifully create such a wonderful example of a mysterious yet relatable fictional world. I love this, though, the book stop book. I mean, perfect. We got the book.
Yeah.
A book like Homecoming allows the reader to get lost in the world, and what can be more escapist? So my question is, what is Kate's process for developing these intricate plot lines? And you've talked a lot about this program that you use, but besides the program, in your head, you've got to have these different strands going and say, I've got to pick this one up now to weave. I'm always thinking with your books that you're weaving something and you're weaving together. And I'm always thinking that the book at the end is like a piece of fabric. And if I pulled one string out, the book wouldn't be the same. And I think we've talked about this in the past, because when I see your books, it's just such a complete work that if the yellow was missing, it wouldn't be there. So it's in your head like that too. What are we doing here?
Yeah, absolutely. And I should be really clear that, because I did mention that the technology that helps to write the story down, but it doesn't play a part in the coming up with the idea and the planning and the overall plotting. That is coming up with keeping the complexity of a story that fills so many pages and so many characters and whose lives intersect across time. For me, the only way to do it is to absolutely live with that book for the entire time that I'm dreaming it up, writing it, and editing it. It is 100% in my mind at all times. Now, so are my children and my other life. So it's really busy. It's really busy up here. And that is just the reality for me of being a writer. And it's not always comfortable because it's really, busy, but I also love it, and I feel bereft when I don't have it. There is something missing when I finish a book and it goes out into the world and I'm not in the next one. Every single time I finish and I send the last edit off, I say, that's it. I'm having a break. Thank God that's done. And without fail, the next day I'm at the stationery shop getting the next notebook because I have to have it. I once had a friend, I was telling her about this, and she said, oh, that sounds really awful. And I was thinking about it, I went, it's not awful. And then I realized it's the same for readers. Every time you pick up a book and you finish it, you don't go, well, I'm not reading again now. That was great, but it was a lot to think about. Of course not. You're hunting for the next one. And it's the same drive to have that world. It just lasts a bit longer. So I mentioned that there are these three distinct phases: the dreaming, the writing, and the editing. And creating a rich, deep world, it involves all three of those. The dreaming is obvious. It's thinking and dreaming and wondering and asking questions, and it comes brighter and brighter. And I can see more and more of it in my head. And then at a certain point, I'm compelled to start writing it. And I start writing, and inevitably, I'll write a scene and I'll print it out and read it, and it's awful. It's thin, and the way they speak to one another it's just words on a page, and the setting isn't real. So I scribble all over it, and I type the changes in, and I print it again, and I read it, and it's awful. It's thin and flimsy, and I scribble again, and I get rid of dialogue I don't need, and I embellish the scene, and what am I seeing? And I do that for every scene over and over until finally I read the scene and it's alive. And that's when I move on to the next one. And you might think that that's counterproductive, but for me, in the process of doing that, I'm getting to know the scene and the setting and the characters and the way they speak. And so new little filaments of ideas that will weave through into the next scene and beyond are coming to the fore. And so for me, that, even though I have heard people say that they would never edit while they're in the writing process, for me, that sort of editing is part of the writing process because it's all becoming more vivid, and I need that to push on into the next part of the book.
Right. And it's when you leave at the end of the day, are you at the end of a scene, like, do you have to finish your idea for the day, like no matter where you are? Or do you just start something, write a couple of notes and say, pick it up tomorrow? I'll just go there.
No, I'm super undisciplined. I just don't have a temperament where I can say, well, full stop, I'll leave that and I'll come back to it. No, I will leave it and go and, start doing dinner and chatting about how the day was with other people. But a part of my mind is still, and the moment I can sneak back and embellish or put the idea down, even if it's, 11 p.m. and I'm in the middle of something else, if it's come to me, I will go and jot it down. But I have just learned that that's the way for me. It's a, and sort of osmosis between my two worlds.
Well, and a lot of times people say they can spend a day writing a paragraph. They can spend a day getting a page right. And I just didn't feel it. I don't feel like what that's going on. And I interviewed an author, Anna Quinlan, a couple of weeks ago, and she said she always leaves in the middle of a sentence so that she figures she can at least get up and write something the next day. And I thought that was so funny. And she says, at least I know I've got something down on the page for tomorrow.
Yeah, that's a very, very good idea. And it's true. You can sit at your desk all day and end up with negative words because you realize that something you'd written the day before is terrible and you need to delete it. But it's never time wasted, because even if you only write a paragraph, you're doing a lot more than that. You're working out what you don't want to say. You're, the unconscious is a very powerful thing. And I think you can feel that you're not making progress, but at some level, the progress is happening. I'm a big fan of walking, of doing the things that take you away from the desk at those times, because there is something about one step after the other, nature, fresh air, to really shift your perspective and get those thoughts that were back in the unconscious coming to the fore.
No, it's just absolutely fascinating to hear how the process is behind the scenes. Patty Blues from Macomb, Michigan, maybe I'm doing this wrong, asked me to share a comment and a question. She said, I just finished Homecoming. I usually fly through books. I savored this one. I read it over several weeks. I was completely transformed, especially to Australia. Thank you for putting a fantastic book on my hands. It was a delight. And her question is, I was wondering about the suitcase that was hidden in the attic. Jess was instructed to destroy its contents. My gut feeling is that Nora actually wanted Jess to open it, but I was wondering if Kate could elaborate on what she thought.
That's a very good question. And this brings me back to what we were discussing about once you put a book out into the world, and there's one version that I wrote, but then there are so many other unique versions that rely upon each reader bringing the world back to life. And I really love that Patty has had that sense of Nora. Do you know what it makes me think about? Because I'm not going to give 100% answer, because of course in that version of the story, then that is what happened, and I love that. And what it makes me think about, one of the themes that we've discussed is that idea that the truth can depend upon the teller. And within the family, the Turner Bridges family, Nora, Polly, and Jess, Nora has very much designated herself the family storyteller. She is the one who holds the reins on the information that's given to the others. And both Polly and Jess have formed their senses of self, their identities, based on the things they've been told by Nora. And I really like the idea that at that moment when Nora has died and she's left these instructions for Jess, Nora has lost the ability to hold those reins anymore. And Jess has that choice. And for the purposes of the book, where we are coming to see the world and this family through a different lens, first by meeting Polly and learning that the stories that Jess has been told about Polly and her reasons for doing certain things are not quite, not necessarily as they seem through Nora's view, we get to also see Jess make that decision to, I suppose, take control herself and see the story from a different perspective.
Oh, it's just so interesting because there are a couple of authors I know that said they have these, the big boxes that you have. They have some that say, no, do not publish ever. I will come back and haunt you. No, burn immediately. Because they said there's some things that, like, why did I do that? But you can't get rid of it. You've got to have that bucket still, just in case,
Look, I'm not going to lie. When I was in my storeroom looking at all these papers, my mind did jump ahead to that point, saying, boy, I'm going to have to deal with these at some point because I just can't leave all of this.
It's either going to go to some museum or library, either that or I don't know. What could they do with these? I'm not sure,
And what sense would they make of them?
It's like, what are these notes? Ricky Gonzalez is going to join us now from Tampa, Florida, with a story as well as a question. So Ricky, looking forward to hearing this story.
Hey there. Hi to everyone.
Hi, Ricky.
Watching. Hello. Hi, Kate. So nice to meet you. Thank you, Carol, for making this happen. It's my first time in this, in an event like this. So I'm kind of nervous. So I'm going to read my story and make one. So I am from Cuba, and I was 21 when I first came to the United States, to the border back in 2019. At the time, the situation at the border was way more complicated than it is today. So I was put under ICE custody for 2.5 months at an immigration detention center in California. There was a lot of free time, and not knowing what the future held for me, depression kicked in. But then I discovered that this place had a library. I didn't know English at all back then, but they had Kate Morton's books in Spanish. So the first one I read was El Jardín Olvidado, which is The Forgotten Garden. And I loved this book that much that I went back to the library looking for another book by Kate Morton. And then I found La Casa de Rivington, which is The House of Rivington, which I adored, and I still remember the plot twist at the end. These two books made me escape from the reality I was living in. So I will remember the author's names after that. So more than 3 years later, in April last year, when I saw that Kate Morton was coming out with a new book called Homecoming, of course I had to buy it. But this time I was almost 2 years into English school, so I got myself a signed copy in English. And that's how I went from reading Kate Morton for the first time ever in Spanish while at the detention center to reading her most recent book in the original English and in a complete different context. So here's my question. After reading the book, I loved Isabel Turner's character. So I would love to get to know more beyond the entries in her journal, how her life was before and after meeting Mr. Turner, get to know more about her love story with Percy. So will you ever write a prequel from Isabel Turner's perspective and everything that happened in 1959?
Well, first of all, Ricky, thank you so much for sharing your story and for being here today. Thank you very much. While you were speaking, you made me think so much about well, many things, but first of all, the power of books. In Homecoming, one of the things, because there are many different ideas about what makes us feel at home. You know, it can be a place, it can be people. Jess decides that it's not feeling alone, not feeling lonely, is feeling at home. But I've often thought, as a book lover from the beginning, that books are a type of home, that it's a place you can go into where you feel held, nested at home. And I love the fact that my books were that in some small part for you at that time in your life. So thank you so much for sharing that. I am going to pass your story on to my beloved Spanish publisher, Gonzalo. He will love to know that as well. Coming back to your question, I love that because Isabel, she's not actually in the book. She's not in Homecoming for long, even though she's such a vital character. And I really loved her. So I love that idea of turning her story into its own book, particularly because even before she came to Australia, she had a very interesting life. Often that can be part of when you write a book with lots of different characters and times and layers, you can forget how she isn't in the book for long, but I spent a lot of time creating her childhood and her experience with her parents and the things that had happened to her that brought her through the Second World War and on to her life in Australia. So I'm going to keep that idea registered here and keep a lookout for that possible Isabel book.
Well, thank you for answering, and I really loved the book and all books I've read by you. So keep writing, keep sharing your art, and I'll keep buying every book you come up with. So
thank you
so
much, Ricky, and best of luck. And your English is brilliant. My goodness, 2 years, amazing.
Ricky, thanks so much for joining us, and thanks for putting that idea in Kate's head. We really like that. We like moments like that. Renee Casella is joining us now from Charleston, South Carolina, and she's got a couple of questions. Renee, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks, Kate, for your time today. My first question is, when did you first decide to be a writer?
Well, I started out as a reader, and it's funny, I can look back and I found something I wrote in very little when I was very young in primary school, saying how much I loved writing. But I have to say, it never occurred to me that people like me could become writers. And I've wondered over the years why that is. And I think perhaps it's because the books I was reading as a child were usually written by people who'd lived many decades before I did. And I had acquired them in secondhand shops and garage sales because my mum was an antique dealer, and that's how I got my books. So they always came to me as sort of dusty old tomes that I would disappear inside. So it wasn't like, now where authors are in schools and children say, oh, writing, and that's the person who made the book. To me, they were these incredible stories that arrived from the heavens and were just there. So it didn't occur to me until I was in my early 20s, and I have two sisters, two younger sisters, and my youngest sister, who was 14 at the time, came to stay with me, and she said, "Oh, I've written a book." I said, "Really?" She said, "Yes, can you read it for me?" And she handed me this pile of paper, a manuscript, and I started to read. And it turned out that it was, I don't know if you call them Mills and Boon over there, Harlequin. It was like a romance. What would you call them, Carol?
It'd be a romance.
How are they published?
Yeah, probably
a romance. And very racy, far racier than anyone needs to read from their 14-year-old sister, I can tell you. But it was great. It had a beginning and a middle and an end. And we both decided, well, she was staying with me because, I loved books and I was studying English. We both went and bought notebooks to come up with ideas for stories that we were going to start writing. And that is how I began writing my first manuscript, which I just found in the storeroom. And I finished it. So it is complete, unpublishable. But if only it had been publishable. No, but I just fell in love with it from the very first day. It's, in Japan, they have the term, the ikigai, the thing you find that it just brings you joy and you were meant to do it. For me, that's what writing felt like. From the very first day, I just felt that sigh of relief of, this is me. And I have done it ever since. The first two manuscripts weren't published, and I was resigned to the fact that I would never be a published author, but I just loved doing it. So I continued. I wouldn't have been able to stop.
How did what you anticipated about being a writer compare to the reality of being a writer?
Well, with a beginning like that, and a very inauspicious beginning, my imagining of what it would be like to be an author, the writing bit is as I experienced and imagined, but the being published part was very different, because when I imagined being published, I thought to have one copy of my book somewhere on a favorite shelf in a favorite bookstore with the spine with my name on. That was my wildest hope and dream, particularly having written two unpublished manuscripts. And then I had a baby and I started writing my third manuscript purely out of love with no expectation whatsoever. And as it happens, that is the manuscript that was then picked up. And before it was published in Australia, it had sold in different places around the world. And so it became a much bigger book than I ever could have imagined. So the reality was so far outside my imaginings. I never thought I would be sitting in an office talking to beloved readers in the US and beyond about something I had written. That is such a joy and a privilege. And I'm, so glad and grateful for everything that has followed.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Renee. Great questions, really great questions. So I'm going to ask one or two more questions before we head to audience questions. And the first one is, that book that you started in London that's in the drawer, did it stay in the drawer, or has that been resurrected? Is it because you can travel more now, but you really seem to love your life where you are?
Yes, I can. And you know what? I am so happy to be able to tell you that it has been resurrected. And the thing is, to resurrect it some years later, it needed some new elements, because when you write as I do, and so much of yourself is in the world of the book, we have all collectively, globally, been through so much in the past 4 years that the perspective that I bring is new and different from the person I was in 2019 when I was coming up with the ideas. And so it took a while for me to discover what those new threads would be, and how to take what I had and bring it back to life and feed new threads in. But it so happens that now the version of that story that I am now, I'm happy to say, in the process of bringing to life, has, I think, got better and deeper and richer, and new strands have found their way in, and the themes have developed. So I'm delighted to be able to tell you that new life has been breathed into it.
the little paddles came out. We brought that book back to life. But you know what? You're right, because we do see life so differently now. And also the scope of the way we're looking at things. I think the world has changed so dramatically over these last 4 years. When I sit there and think back, there are times where somebody will say, well, back in 2019, I'm like, whoa, that was like a lifetime ago. You know, it was, oh, remember when we had the office in New York and I had to go every day? Whoa, look how much more I get done now. You know, all these little things. But at the same time, to infuse into a book who you've become, which is somebody very different than that person from 4 years ago. You know, not just because of the age of
Absolutely.
children, you know.
Yeah.
So I think Tom Donadio, our brilliant editorial director, voice of God. Tom, do you have questions for us? It's always like an Oz
We
moment.
do have questions, yes. So first question is from Dee. She says, this was a terrific book. I am now going back and reading Kate's backlist. My question is, why do you think the American author did not write an updated version once he knew about the truth? It really was so unfair.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think by then he was so connected to Nora. I think he had really bonded with Nora, and to do that would be revealing so much that was private, I suppose, and personal for Nora. It would have been a very interesting ethical choice to make, to publish what he knew once he knew it. I love those questions, though.
There's a lot of interest in the Q&A about your writing process, so there will be a lot of questions about that. Antoinette asks, how hard is it to come up with the first sentence in a book, or is that the easiest?
It's hard when you put pressure on yourself, you know, come up with an amazing first line, blank. So often I find you have to trick yourself and say, I'm not really starting the book, I'm just going to write something, and, you know, I can get rid of it later. And that's the best way, just to start. Just write something, because you can't edit a blank screen. And by tricking yourself, sometimes that's the way of latching on to what is the true beginning of the story, rather than trying to come up with something that sounds momentous, or something that people in 50 years will be saying in the list of best first lines.
You know, also, you were writing the book within the book. Did you write the whole book within the book at once and then do the other parts? I think that's one question we didn't address. We've got the true crime. And do you love true crime?
Yeah, I wish I could remember what it was that first made me think to tell the story that way with the true crime novel. I love embedded texts. Because I'm always seeking verisimilitude, I always feel that if one of the characters is a playwright, for instance, and we're hearing about a play, we should see some of it. And so too, I love the idea in this book that my readers, got to see the primary text, the actual book that Daniel Miller had written, rather than just have my description of it or one of my characters' descriptions of it. But it had to be interesting enough too. And I wanted it to feel that you were reading a voice that wasn't my voice, my authorial voice. So I hope that Daniel Miller's voice is different and more of his period. But once I decided I was going to have a true crime book, and I think it might be because I needed to find out how policing would have worked in South Australia in the period. And it's very difficult to find information on that sort of detail, because unlike somewhere like New York or London, where you would find history books about the Metropolitan Police, say, South Australia is so much smaller, there just isn't the same demand for those kind of published resources. So I thought, well, if only there were a true crime book written at the period showing the policing. And there wasn't, but I was able to look up the Somerton body case, which I mentioned in Homecoming. And I went to the library and did a trove search, which is where they pull up all of the old newspaper stories from when that case was being reported in the late 1940s. and I printed off every article I could find, much as Jess does in Homecoming for the Turner family mystery. And I read them, and it was such a wonderful experience as a researcher to find myself drenched within the investigation, with the language of the time, the way people referred to one another as Mr. and Mrs. in the press. And I was trying to get a sense of the way the police worked, but it gave me so much more that I was able to then enfold into Daniel Miller's story. So with his story, I wanted it to be something that, not just extracts, where you could actually put it together and read it like a book, even though it's broken up within. I think I even, in the first draft, it might have appeared in more of a single portion, and through the editing I was able to shift it around a bit just to mix up the balance of the book and to reveal things at different times. But yes, I did want it to feel like a real book that a real journalist had written at the time.
Yeah, I love that.
Now, I know earlier you had talked about the writing program that you use, and Joanne is curious to know which program is it. There was some interest I noticed in the chat about that too.
It's Scrivener is the one that I use. I'm sure there are probably others, but that's the one that I happened upon and have used since.
That was the one that
if
was
you're a
mentioned in
visual
the
person.
chat.
Yeah.
Oh, an anonymous attendee asks, there's a typewriter behind you. Do you use it when writing?
You know what? I think my reaction to the incredible technological advancements throughout this period is to become more mechanical. So I've gone backwards. And so I became really interested in typewriters. And I thought, I wonder if typing will help me to see my story differently, because, you know, I love to write by hand. And I thought maybe this will slow down the way I write, and I'll be forced, rather than going back and forth within the same paragraph and editing as I go and jumping around, maybe it will be an interesting experience to try writing sentence by sentence, because I have to, because that's what the typewriter forces you to do. You know, you can't just skip back up the top and add a word or a line. And so with all the best intentions in the world, I got myself a typewriter and I loaded it and I started to type. I mean, I can touch type. I taught myself how to do that, you know, some years ago, but it's so hard. I have so much admiration for typists of the past. You really need to work on your finger muscles. So I'm going to have to get to be a much better typist before I can write it anywhere near the pace and with the accuracy I need to in order to write a book as long as mine. So watch this space. I'm determined at some point I'll be able to announce that I did write a manuscript purely using the typewriter. But I'm really going to have to, you know, work on these first.
But I feel like atmosphere means something to you too. And having that there and the flowers behind you and, you know, just every single thing in the office is part of you. And that's what you have to write. And if the flowers are in the wrong place, I'll get more, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I can write. I mean, I have 3 children, and I've never written as a published author without at least one baby or child. So I know how to write, you know, wherever I can find the space to do it. And the space at some points has been inside a cupboard. You know, my husband put a table in there, and that's where my office was for a while. So I can write anywhere, but I do enjoy, I'm visual. I like an aesthetic. I like to be surrounded. I like a nest. I mean, don't we all? Isn't that what home is feeling nested in some way, even if it's tiny?
In that little closet.
So a couple of book-specific questions just came in from Janet. How did you get the idea to use pufferfish poisoning as the cause of death? I read it takes 4 to 6 hours for death to occur from this type of poison. How did you imagine the children and Isabel all sickened and died on the same schedule?
Well, now that was one of those things where I had to take a leap of faith at the beginning. So one of the first parts of the book that came to me, in fact, the first, was Percy's prologue. and what he found. And I knew that it was going to look like they were asleep. It wasn't going to be I mean, obviously it's horrific to find a family in that situation, but it was going to look peaceful and still. And he was going to be able to think that they were asleep at first. And I loved the way that scene looked in my mind and how it felt as a writer. But I didn't know how I was going to affect it. But I had such sort of blind faith, because I was enjoying the process of writing the book and going on from there, that I didn't actually think about how I was going to solve this problem until I was well into it and thought, gosh, how did it happen? I knew it would be possible because the Somerton body case that I mentioned was a real life crime that occurred in South Australia about 10 years before, where a man was found propped up near the beach wearing a suit with all the tags cut out, and he had nothing identifying on him. And he looked like he was asleep, but he wasn't. And to this day, investigators are only just starting to work out who he might have been, but they were not able to discover how he had died. And so I knew this was possible, that someone could be found looking peaceful and asleep when they had been poisoned, but I didn't know how. And when I printed out all the newspaper articles, they didn't release that information in the court reporting, which was a real disappointment for me, I can tell you, because I needed to find some way. And so I had to get in touch with poison experts at university. And it's one of those letters asking for help that you write, where you hope that they trust that you are indeed a fiction writer asking for the means to kill people without any evidence. And so I was able to run a few of my ideas past a poison expert, who sent me some very useful articles. And then I had to decide between a few different ways and means. And that's when I realized that the mousse was going to be absolutely perfect. And that's one of the things that's exciting as a writer, because of the type of poison I wanted to use. The characters who I'd created, with Percy and Meg and the boys and their hobbies and the type of place this is in South Australia where kids might go fishing, it all starts to weave together and follow the direction that certain pieces of research or plot turns that have to be there start to open up other opportunities in the story.
Amazing. Pufferfish, the pufferfish, who knew?
I think
exactly.
You kind of,
deadly.
I think you kind of answered this already, but Mary says, when you started writing this book, did you know that they would be killed with the fish paste? I thought that was genius.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think I probably did answer it, but no, I didn't know. I didn't know what it would be. When I first wrote it, in fact, I thought Percy was going to appear as the storyteller of the prologue and then not appear in the book again. I loved this idea that we get to know this character, but his whole role is just to lead us to this scene. But once I'd written it, I just knew he belonged in the rest of the book. And he certainly did. And his family, of course, become key players in the story.
Mm-hmm.
We have a question from an anonymous attendee. I met you many years ago at a small bookstore in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Do you remember being there? I recall you saying you planned your books on note cards before beginning the writing process. Is that still true? I have read and enjoyed all your books.
Yes, absolutely. I was just looking around in case I could see one of my notebooks, but they're not right beside me. But yes, I do. And I do remember, I'm not sure how this is so, but I seem to remember every event I've done. As soon as someone mentions the bookstore where it was, I just have a visual memory of it. Yeah, I do. And I really look forward to touring on the ground in the US and visiting some of my favorite bookstores again soon. And I hope to see you there.
Next book.
Next book. Yep.
Now, Dee is curious about the title. Was this always the title, Homecoming?
Yes, it was. For a little while, I wondered about the homecoming, but then I realized I liked the declaratory nature of the single word homecoming, and also calling it the homecoming seemed to direct it to one particular homecoming, whereas the book is about so many homecomings, whether they're micro or macro. So I liked the idea that the whole book was about various sorts of coming home.
That totally makes sense. Now, Elizabeth asks, how many hours per day do you write? Do you have a strict schedule?
Feeding back into my undisciplined writerly nature, I don't have a strict schedule. And I mean, as I've mentioned, I have children, so there are things that have to be done at certain times. So I can't just give over to the muse. But I write, the book is always in my mind. So even if I'm driving on the school run and carrying on a conversation about chess club, or, you know, whether the wrong shoes have been worn or whatever the case may be, a part of my brain is still, you know, figuring out the problem that I want to solve, or something that I want to write, or something that doesn't feel quite like I've got it yet. So it's always there. That these things just live in tandem in my mind at all times. But I work every day. I don't like, I mean, if I don't work over the weekend, that's fine. But certainly every weekday, I either at my desk or with notebooks, whenever I can. I really enjoy creating books, and it is part of the fabric of my life. So it's not a chore that I have to schedule, even though sometimes it's really difficult and there are problems, and it is like having homework for the rest of your life. That can still, believe it or not, be an enjoyable way to live.
Like, you have homework, I have homework. I didn't figure out this clock today, so you can't get algebra. Okay, we're on the same team.
We have another anonymous attendee question. What is the best piece of writing advice you've received that you still use in your own writing?
There are a few that come immediately to mind, and I bet I'll think of other great pieces as soon as we finish this conversation. One that I have always felt is, you know, when people say write what you know, I always think, no, write what you love. Write something, you know, because you can learn the things you don't know. You need to write something that you are drawn to do it. You want to do it. You want to be in that world, and you want to tell that story about those people in that place. That is, for me, the most important thing. And on a more practical level, many years ago, before I was a writer, my mum, who is a incredible reader, she always has a book in hand. I mean, she can read, you know, 8 books a week. She's unstoppable. And we were standing in the kitchen, and I was still in high school, and she was musing about what made a scene stick in something, you know, come to life in the reader's mind. And she said to me that it was always about the small details. She said, if you can show me the fly under the plastic cling wrap on top of the row of sandwiches in a small gas station kiosk, you don't need to tell me anything else about that place. I know what it feels like if I can see that fly stuck under the plastic on top of the sandwiches. And that has stuck in my mind since, that sometimes, I mean, you can spend thousands and thousands of words painting a scene, but it's those little details are important, and they can do a lot of heavy lifting. Not always about flies, but you know what I mean.
At what point does your mom see your books? Does she see them when they're completely done, or somewhere along manuscript?
I give her a completed manuscript to read, usually the first draft. So when I finished it, before it's been through any of the editorial.
Once the mom gets it.
She's a very good, close reader, actually.
I know this may be a difficult question to answer, but anonymous attendee asks, what's your favorite book that you've written so far, and why?
Oh, gosh, that's a great question, because the one that you're about to write is always the favorite, because you're investing in it all of these hopes and dreams and expectations, and you haven't yet reduced it through your inability to find the right words to lock down the things that you want to say in words. So, that's always the next one. But having said that, because they all connote different parts of my life, they're all special to me in different ways. The Forgotten Garden often comes to mind because I gave Nell the house that I lived in at the time, and I used a story from my grandmother's life when I was writing the book, and some of the stories from my husband's family's life as well. So it is a very personal book, and it contains a lot of the things that I love. But then each book at the time I was writing it was the favorite.
Mm.
Mhm. And I think we're going to end the Q&A on this. And I think this will transition into Carol's next question about what's next for you. Elizabeth asks, when do you start thinking about and working on your next book? Do you plan to set future books in England or Australia or somewhere else?
Well, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I always think I'll have a break, and I always end up with a notebook. But I think often the expectation that the next idea will be there and ready to run, for me anyways, directly after finishing one manuscript, is a false hope, because so much that planning and dreaming stage is so important for me. Otherwise, I suspect that I would end up repeating the same ideas. You need a bit of time to let go of the thoughts and ideas and micro stories that made up the previous book before launching a new one. And so I have to learn to be patient, because being inside a book, as you know, as a reader, is the most wonderful feeling. And so there's an urge to want to be back within the next book. But it is imperative for me to take that time to scribble and dream and frustrate myself because I haven't worked out the story yet, and I don't quite know what the relationships are between the characters and their histories and how they connect. But if I can let go of that expectation and open myself to, letting my intuition work and feeling those slight sparks of excitement when I realize that, I know how this character connects here, or I can, be on the school run listening to a podcast and hear someone say something that makes me think, that's what that character needs, or that's how that's going to tie together. That is also a wondrous part of the process. And so I have to give over to that for a while. And I know that when the time is right, I'm absolutely compelled to start locking it down on the page. And that's when the writing begins.
And that's when the writing begins. And that is what we're so ready for, is for the writing to begin. Do you have a timeline where you think the next one will be ready? Are we years? Are we?
Well, I am in the writing part, so I'm delighted to be able to say that. And I'm a very wholehearted writer. So once that book starts to come to life, I sort of have to have closed the homecoming bubble and let it drift away out there into the world, so that I can fully give over to the new characters and their new relationships and their world. So I mean, today is almost stealing of that bubble, and then homecoming drifts away out into the world. So I'm now writing in earnest, and I can't wait to have this book ready and out there with you, and God willing, be on tour and be able to catch up in person with the next one.
Absolutely love that. And I know our whole audience feels the same way. They would travel to go see you. I can feel it now. I would love that. It was just, I think everybody has that complete feeling. And, It's so special for us to be one of the last places you're talking about homecoming and say, this is like my farewell party to homecoming. I'm ready to move on to the next step. Because a lot of authors say that they're on tour and they said, I can't write the next book because I'm still thinking about this book. And then if too much time has gone on, I love this, that somebody's asked a question about a book from years ago and they're like, really? Tell me what happened in that scene. Feel free to refresh my memory because you're into the next book. You're into the next group of characters.
That's so true, and it feels disloyal to say it because, of course, when you're writing that book, you are 100% in it, but you can't keep that many worlds open in that detail at the one time. It's impossible, and so it's inevitable that in order to give yourself over to the next one, you have to let go of some of those details that felt so real at the time. It's a really, I suppose it's like any book that you've read, if so, you could have loved a book 10 years ago, but if someone mentions a scene to you now, you think, oh, I can't quite remember that. I'll have to refresh. It's similar to that. You cannot keep them all fully alive at the same time, or else you won't have enough energy or space to give over to the next one. And I have to say to you too, yes, this is a bit like the closing and the farewell to homecoming, but I would not have missed the chance to speak with you, Carol, and to your lovely readers. So I am so happy to have been able to do this.
I tell you, when we booked this date, I was so excited. It was like a big on my calendar because we had such good time 6 years ago. And we had a good time when we talked about this book earlier, which we'll have to link people to as well. So thank you so much. It means a lot that you spent this much time with us and took the time on a holiday, no less, in Australia.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you for reading, and thank you for your support, Carol, and for loving and championing homecoming. I feel very blessed. Thank you.
Thank you so very, very much. And next time we're there. We're writing it down already. We're ready to go. 3 years from now, whatever. Okay.
I'm there.
Have an absolutely lovely day because you're in day. We're in night.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks so much. So a couple of more announcements from us. Wasn't that fantastic? Wasn't that great? I just have to stop for a second. Was that just great? I mean, can we just see a little applause in the chat or whatever? Because I just thought she was fantastic. And every time I speak with her, every time I've been in her company, it's just more special than the time before. And this was just as perfect. So a couple of announcements from us. Tonight's event will be available on YouTube and our podcast later, probably this week, Friday, and we'll alert you when it's live. Our next Bookaccino Live Book Group event will be with Ann Napolitano, and she'll be joining us on Wednesday, May 29th at 8 o'clock to discuss her New York Times bestseller, Hello Beautiful, as well as her new book that is out next Tuesday. It's a paperback edition called Within Arm's Reach. It was her debut novel, and it was originally published in 2004. And I'm reading it now, and once again, I'm enjoying her love of family in this book. And on Wednesday, May 8th in the afternoon at 2 o'clock, for all those who can either join us or play hooky from work, we know what that's like, folks, we'll be hosting our monthly Bookaccino Live Book Preview event, talk about books releasing between May 7th and June 4th, with a look ahead at some July titles. Sign up for this is now available on bookreporter.com. Stay on top of everything that we're doing. And folks, there's a lot. Be sure to sign up for our newsletters. You can go to tbrnetwork.com. There's a newsletter section. We've got one specifically about events, besides our weekly newsletter and on sale and reading group guides, and lots for you to do there. And we have more than 190 Book Reporter Talks to interviews, including an earlier interview that I did with Kate when when Homecoming just came out. So be sure to check those out on our YouTube channel, Book Reporter Talks to. Thank you so much for joining us. The evening could not have happened without all of you being a part of it. We appreciate it. To all that joined us on screen, thank you. And to Voice of God, as always, brilliant job. Thanks so much, everybody. We hope to see you soon.